Right, everyone, we are going to be reading chapters 10 to 12 of Frindle. In these chapters, we're going to be focusing a lot on inferencing. Inferencing, remember, is when we take what we see in a story and we use our background knowledge to come up with some ideas about what the author might not be telling us. So, in your assignment, you're going to have to do some inferencing work. It's a little more writing today, but I think you'll be able to do just fine with it. With that being said, I also want us to make sure that we're taking our time on our work. This should be like centers work, meaning you should spend 15 to 20 minutes on each activity. So without further ado, let's get started. Chapter 10, Freedom of the Press. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was the occasional burglary, the teens got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town council or planning board now and then. But mostly things were calm and orderly in Westfield, and every Thursday, the Westfield Gazette proved it. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. He told Judy that a bunch of 5th graders were making trouble and that they were not obeying teachers anymore and that there was something about a secret code word they were all using. And half the students had been kept after school one day last week, including his own little girl. The only story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main Street. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So Judy Morgan showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Mrs. Chatham had been to visit Nick's parents. The sign on the door said, "All visitors must report to the office." And she did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word Frindle. She stepped back 2 paces, aimed her camera at once, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more, and then stepped into the office. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan, and I work for the Westfield Gazette. I'd like to know about that poster outside the office, the one about this word, Frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the hook. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Mrs. Chatham or Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. She said, "You'll have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Mrs. Chatham's free." She was. There isn't a principal alive who won't find the time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporters were invited into Mrs. Chatham's office. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When she asked about the poster outside the office door, Mrs. Chatham laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's nothing really. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time that we put a stop to it." The principal's laugh sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did that notice put an end to the prank? I heard that a lot of children were kept after school this week. Would you like to tell me a little about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Mrs. Chatham looked, well, like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile. She said, "Well, we do still have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit. I don't think the children have really been trying to be disrespectful. They're just having fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Mrs. Chatham went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word Frindle, and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes. When the principal had finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I asked Mrs. Granger a few questions?" Mrs. Chatham said, "Oh, no, not at all." But Judy could tell the principal wished she would just go away. What could she say, though? Mrs. Chatham couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger, because after all, America's a free country with a free press. If Judy really wanted to, she could talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. It was sooner. In 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing at the doorway of room 12, looking in at Mrs. Granger. There were about 15 children sitting at desks scattered around the room, busy writing out their 100 sentences. She knocked on the door, and the teacher and the students looked up from their work. "I'm Judy Morgan from Westfield Gazette, Mrs. Granger. May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Judy could see past her and saw every kid in the room was straining to listen. Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away. Gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. "So I hear that you plan to help stop the students from using their new word. How was that battle?" Whoops. How goes the battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile, and her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it is not a battle. I am merely helping my students to see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new and useless word. They should each learn to use the words we already have. But, of course, all of this is just a silly fad. And when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict this fad will fade." Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, "Any idea how it all got started?" Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch fire with that question, and she said, "Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea, a fifth-grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now you will have to excuse me, Miss Morgan, for I have papers I must grade." And with a brief, firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on a bench outside the office so she could look over her notes and make sure that they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up, put her notebook into her large black purse, waved goodbye to a frowning Mrs. Freed, and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out the other door. Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, "Why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Don't you hate staying after school?" A boy who was almost falling over the weight of his backpack looked up at her and smiled. "It's not that bad. There's always a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now." And then the kid said Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment papers anymore. They were sure because where you were supposed to write, "I am writing this punishment with a pen," everyone kept writing the word Frindle every fourth or fifth sentence, and Mrs. Granger hadn't said anything. One girl bragged that she had written the word Frindle 45 times on her sheets today. She grinned and said, "That's a new record." "And this boy Nick," Judy asked, "has he had to stay after school too?" The kids giggled, and a tall boy with reddish-brown hair and glasses said, "Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him." The reporter smiled and said, "Do you think I could find Nick and talk to him this afternoon?" The boy looked at Judy for a second and then said, "I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might say something stupid and get in trouble." Then he grinned at his friends. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. So what can we infer about that? We know that the reporter was trying to find Nick, but she realized that she was actually talking to who? The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Gazette offices addressed to Judy Morgan, and below her name was written Frindle Story. When Judy opened it, there was a class picture, the 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed. But there was something really odd about the picture. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding up a pen, and each little mouth was puckered the same way. She was puzzled for a second, and then she said softly, "Of course, they're saying Frindle." Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive was 3rd row, fifth from the left. Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning red-haired boy with glasses that she had talked to in the school parking lot yesterday. She chuckled and said, "Well, well, well. Pleased to meet you, Nicholas Allen." All right. Sip of coffee there. All right, so that is a very important chapter, and that chapter gives us an idea of who Judy Morgan is and what Judy Morgan is trying to do. And Judy Morgan is a very important character moving along in the story, so I want us to pay attention to what her point of view is and how maybe her ideas about Frindle change as the story goes on. Chapter 11. Extra, extra, read all about it. On Thursday morning, the Westfield Gazette was delivered to 12,297 homes and post offices in Westfield. The story about Lincoln Elementary School was the first item on the front page. In the headline, "Local 5th grade teacher says, 'Move over, Mr. Webster.'" It was quite an article. Not that Judy Morgan didn't tell the truth. Every statement in the article was completely true. It was the particular way she told the truth that got things hopping around town. For example, take this sentence about Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger, champion of the forces of order and authority, is battling hundreds of young Frindle fighters. Neither side is giving in. Or this bit about Nick. Everyone agrees that Nick Allen masterminded this plan and cleverly raises issues about free speech and academic rules. He is the boy who invented the word. Or this last sentence in the article. One thing's for sure. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School love their Frindles, and no one seems to be backing off this war of the words. And of course the Westfield Gazette published the class picture too. And Mrs. Granger and Nick were identified for all the world to see. "What is the meaning of this?" That's what Nick's mother said, putting the article in front of Nick's nose when he got home from school. "Did you talk to a reporter? She seems to know an awful lot about you and your new word, young man." "What's the meaning of this?" That's what the school superintendent said to Mrs. Chatham, slapping a copy of the article onto the desk. "Why did you have to talk to that reporter? Don't we have enough trouble getting the taxpayers to pay for the school's articles like this without articles like this banging around town? What's the meaning of this?" That's what Mrs. Chatham said to Mrs. Granger, shaking the newspaper in front of her face. I know you had to talk to that woman, but did you have to say all these things? It'll be a wonder if we don't all get fired." It was quite a Thursday for everyone, and no one could quite figure out how Judy Morgan had gotten that 5th grade class picture. So let's think about this. How do we think Judy Morgan, using inferencing, got that picture? What do we know? What do we know about the picture? What do we know where it might have come from? What do we know about what was written on the back? That's one of your questions in the assignment here. All right, Chapter 12. Chapter 12, Airwaves. Within a week after the article was published in the Westfield Gazette, the kids at the junior high and the kids at the high school had stopped using the word pen and started using the word Frindle. They loved it. Nick became sort of a hero for kids all over town, and he quickly learned that being a hero, even if you're only a local hero, isn't a free ride. It has a price. People noticed Nick when he walked into his dad's hardware store, or when he stood in line at the penny pantry to buy a candy bar. He could feel it when someone recognized him, and that made him shy and awkward. Kids at school started expecting him to be clever and funny all the time, and even for a kid as smart as Nick, that was asking a lot. Every teacher, the office secretary, the principal, even the school nurse and the custodian, all seemed to be watching, always watching. His parents were great about everything. True, his mom had been upset when the article first came out, and so had his dad. Nick had said, "But I didn't do anything wrong, Mom, and neither did the lady from the newspaper." And his parents could see that he was right. The things in the article were true, and the truth is the truth, and nothing could be done about it now. Even though it made them uncomfortable to have their boy talked about all over town, secretly, Nick's mom and dad were pleased. After all, a brand new word is a pretty amazing thing. Their Nicholas was quite a fellow, no getting around it. Someone else in town thought this brand new word was pretty amazing too. Bud Lawrence had lived his whole life in Westfield, and when he was only 19 years old, he saved enough money to make an investment. He looked around for a good idea, and then he bought the first Dairy Queen in the state. After a few years, he bought a McDonald's restaurant. That was almost 30 years ago. And these two restaurants had made him rich, one of Westfield's leading citizens. When Bud Lawrence saw the article about the new word, he had his lawyer file a preliminary trademark claim on the word Frindle. Within 4 days, he had set up a small company that was selling cheap plastic ballpoint pens, specially imprinted with the word Frindle. He sold 3,000 Frindles the first week. They sold out so fast that stores all over Westfield couldn't keep them in stock. Then, just as quickly, kids stopped asking for Frindles. The sales slowed down, and Bud Lawrence started thinking about other projects. A week later, it was Halloween. The leaves started falling, and it seemed like the town was going to quiet down. And it would have if it hadn't been for Alice Lunderson. Alice lived in Betherly, a town 7 miles away from Westfield. She worked part-time for the local CBS TV station in Carrington, a town with about 75,500 people. When there was important area news, like disasters or floods, tornadoes, or sometimes if they came across little stories that seemed cute or original, Alice would call the news station manager in Carrington. If it was a good story, or if it was a day when not much else was happening in the world, the TV station would send out a van with a camera crew to shoot some videotape. Alice subscribed to all the small town newspapers in the area to keep up with local events. Most of them were published on Thursday, and they arrived at her house by Monday or Tuesday. Then it took her a day or so to look through them all. On Wednesday morning, she finally saw the article in the Westfield Gazette about the word war. She read it through twice and looked carefully at the class photograph. She was sure that the story was a winner. The TV station manager in Carrington agreed with her. He called the CBS station in Boston because sometimes Boston picked up stories from Carrington newsroom. The woman in Boston thought the story had some real zip to it, so she called the network editor in New York. When the facts of the Westfield Gazette article got to New York, the staff there loved it. They looked over the schedule sheet for the week and decided that it would be a perfect closing story for the CBS News for the next day, Thursday. Orders flew back through the telephone links from Boston to Carrington to Betherly. By Wednesday at noon, Alice had a go order to take the story all the way. It was her first piece to get onto national news. 20 million viewers would see it. Alice Lunderson and her camera crew stood on Mrs. Granger's front porch Wednesday after school. Mrs. Granger was not impressed at all by the lights and the microphones. She looked right into the camera and said, "I have always said that the dictionary is the finest tool ever made for educating young minds, and I still stand by that. Children need to understand that there are rules about words and language, and these rules have a history that makes sense. And to pretend that a perfectly good English word can be replaced by a silly made-up word just for fun of it, well, it's not something I was ready to stand by and watch without a fight." "And have you lost that fight, Mrs. Granger?" asked the reporter. Mrs. Granger turned her eyes up to nearly full power as she looked into the cameraman, and with a pale smile, she said, "It's not over yet." When Alice and the camera crew showed up to Nick's house, the Allen family was ready for them. Mom and Dad sat on the couch with Nick between them. Nick squinted into the lights. His mom had worked out with Nick what he could say and what he couldn't say. "You remember, young man," she had told him as she combed his hair, "these reporters are just looking for a quick story that will make some excitement. But you have to stay here and live in this town, so mind your P's and Q's." As they sat on the couch, Mrs. Allen had her foot up on top of Nick's under the coffee table. If she pushed down, it meant that the reporter asked a question that she was going to answer for him. Mrs. Allen did not trust reporters. "So, tell me, Nick, why did you make up this new word Frindle?" asked Alice Lunderson. Nick gulped, and he said, "Well, my teacher, Mrs. Granger, said that all words in the dictionary were made up by people, and that they mean what they mean because we say they do. So I thought it would be fun just to make up a new word and see if that was true. And were you surprised when Mrs. Granger got mad about that? Asked Alice with a smile. There was a push on Nick's foot, and his mother said, We never felt that Mrs. Granger got angry. When everyone started using the word Frindle, it just became a disruption. That's really all. She's really a fine teacher. Yeah, said Nick. I mean, I learned a lot of words, and without her, I wouldn't have. So what's next for you in the new word? Alex was wrapping it up. She could see that Nick and his parents were not going to be pushed into saying anything controversial, so she kept things light and happy. Well, said Nick, the funny thing is, even though I invented it, it's not my word anymore. Frindle belongs to everyone now, and I guess everyone will figure out what happens together. Alice also had a short chat with a worried-looking Mrs. Chatham and a smiling Bud Lawrence, maker of the word Frindle. Then she shot her opening bit and her closing bit, and the camera crew drove back to Carrington to edit all the pieces together into a 2-minute news story. The next day, when all the serious news about wars and oil prices and world food supplies had been talked about on the news, the anchorman looked into the camera and smiled. He said, It is believed by many that the word quiz was made up in 1791 by a Dublin theatre manager named Daly. He had bet someone that he could invent a brand new word in the English language, and he chalked up the letters Q-U-I-Z onto every wall and building in town. The next morning, there it was, and in a week, people all over Ireland were wondering what it could mean. A new word had been created. Quiz is the only word in the English language that was invented by one person for no particular reason. That is, until now. Now there is a new word, Frindle. And here is Alice Lunderson in Westfield, New Hampshire, with the story. Alice came onto the screen with a short introduction. Then, right there on TV, Mrs. Granger, and Nick, and Bud Lawrence, and Nick's mom were talking to 20 million people about Frindles. One of those 20 million people was the producer of The Late Night Show with David Letterman. And another one of those 20 million people was the staff writer for People magazine. And another one was the writer for 321 Contact magazine for kids. Dozens of other writers and producers and marketing people saw this story on the news, and all of them smelled a great story. During the next 3 weeks, every man, woman, and child in America heard about this funny new word, and that the kids who were using it instead of the word pen, and kids in Ohio and Iowa and New York and Texas and California, they started using it too. Bud Lawrence was suddenly flooded with orders for anything with the word Frindle on it, and he quickly got interested again, but there were complications. Bud's lawyer said, You see that stack of orders there? Trouble. That's what that is. We got a trademark filed, but it's only like an application. The whole country knows that the little kid made up the word. And unless you make a deal with his dad, you're going to end up with nothing, maybe even a big fat lawsuit. That kid owns the word. When Mr. Allen came home for lunchtime, his wife told him that he had to call Bud Lawrence. It's something about the new word. This was not good news to Tom Allen. He was sick and tired of all the fuss, and being away from the hardware store so much while all this nonsense was happening had put him weeks behind on his paperwork. He'd be lucky now to get his Christmas order in time. Even though he didn't really want anything to do with it, Bud was an old friend. So on the way back to the store, Nick's dad went to Bud Lawrence's office. It's good to see you, said Bud. He stood up and walked around the desk to shake his hands. Have a seat. Tom sat down uneasily, and Bud pulled over another chair. Ever seen Westfield so stirred up about anything in your life? You and Ginny must be pretty proud of that boy of yours. Bud couldn't remember Nick's name. Tom shifted in his chair and nodded. Yes, he's quite something, that's for sure. But I tell you, Bud, I'm ready for all this just to die down and blow away. It's too much fuss. Instantly, Bud saw how he was going to get what he wanted. Well, Tom, I'm afraid it's not really going to go away. Looks like something started up. People are real interested. You probably saw those bright red ballpoint pens around town with the word Frindle on them. That was my doing, just testing the waters. But your boy, he owns the word. I got my lawyer to apply for a trademark a few weeks back because that's just the way I am. New things come along, I like to be right there in the middle of it. He grinned at Tom Allen. Tom smiled back weakly. Right now, I got a shirt printer in Massachusetts, and another one in Chicago, and another one in Los Angeles making t-shirts with the word Frindle above with a picture of a pen. I mean, a Frindle. Each supplier has orders so far for over 20,000 shirts. Profit on every one of those is going to be $2, maybe $3. And I'm talking with some big pen and pencil companies in Hong Kong and Japan about a deal that could be worth some really big money. They've seen this Frindle thing in the media, and they want to buy the rights to the trademark and make a new line of Frindles for kids. I'm not kidding. This is a hot, hot idea. Bud guessed right. Just as he thought, all this made Tom shrink back uncomfortably into his chair. It was too much fuss. Tom, let me be direct with you. As the boy's guardian, you need to do the right thing about all this. I'd like to see where all this is going to go. I'm going to take some risks, spend some money, and see what happens. But I need your permission. I need your signature on these trademark papers. And I need to strike a deal with you about permission to use that trademark. I know it seems like a big ruckus about the word, but we can't tell what's going to come of it unless we take some steps. Bud pointed at the papers on his desk. That's a contract, and it's a fair and honest contract. It gives your boy 30% of whatever profits I might make. That's a fair royalty. Generous for this kind of deal. So what do you say? Make sense? Let me take care of all the fuss and see if some good doesn't maybe come out of all this. The papers and pen were on the desk next to Tom. He looked at Bud, then reached over and picked up the pen and signed both copies of the trademark papers and 3 copies of the contract. I got no reason to doubt you one bit, Bud, and I sure don't want to mess up any of this for myself. Is that it? Is that it? He asked, standing up. Not quite, Tom. Here. Then Bud Lawrence handed Nick's dad a check for $2,250. What's this for? That's what I owe Nick for the sales of the Frindles for the first 3 weeks, explained Tom with a smile. Tom looked at the check and said, This is terrific, Bud, and I'm really glad about it because I'm sure it'll help with Nick's college. But I wish you'd just keep this between us. If Nick knew, he'd probably stop mowing lawns, and I'd never get him to save another penny. So just between us, okay? Bud said, Sure, Tom, I understand. Just between us. And they shook hands. Mr. Allen left Bud's office and walked across the street to the savings bank. He set up a trust account for Nick, and the manager said that he could make arrangements with Mr. Lawrence, so any other money would be deposited automatically. That sounded good to Tom Allen. If he never heard another word about it, that'd be fine. As Nick's dad walked slowly back to the hardware store, he wondered if things were ever going to be the same again in his quiet little town. And that is the end of chapters 10 through 12. So, do your assignment, make sure you click mark as done, and submit at the bottom. Thanks. See ya.